I was pulling the Christmas turkey out of the oven when I heard the moving truck rumble up my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched my daughter-in-law Cassandra step out of her BMW, pointing dramatically at my guest bedroom window, while two burly men unloaded furniture I'd never seen before. My son Marcus stood beside her, hands shoved deep in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with my house entirely. That's when I knew my peaceful retirement was about to become a battlefield I never asked to join. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession. Cassandra's signature impatient knock. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find her standing there with a smile so bright it could power the neighborhood Christmas lights. Surprise, Minnie! Mom and Dad needed a place to stay for just a few months while their condo renovation finishes up. I knew you wouldn't mind since you have all this extra space just sitting empty. Behind her, Marcus finally looked up, his face a mixture of apology and defeat. Behind him, Cassandra's parents, Harold and Dolores, emerged from a taxi. Harold already scanning my property like he was calculating square footage. Dolores clutching a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. I stood in my doorway, turkey cooling forgotten on the counter, watching strangers march into my home carrying boxes labeled Harold's office and Dolores' craft room, as if they'd been planning this invasion for weeks. Because apparently they had been. Let me tell you who I am, because it matters for what comes next. My name is Minnie Rogers, and at 72 years old, I thought I'd earned the right to quiet mornings and decisions that were mine alone. I'm a retired elementary school teacher who spent 43 years shaping young minds in the same brick schoolhouse where I learned to read myself. After my husband Frank passed 5 years ago, I'd finally found my rhythm living alone in the 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought when Marcus was born 35 years ago. The house sits on 2 acres in Millbrook Township, Pennsylvania, with a garden that Frank and I tended together for decades, and a front porch where I drink my morning coffee and watch deer graze in the early light. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, paid off with decades of teacher salaries and careful saving. The mortgage died with Frank, and I'd planned to live out my days here in peace, maybe leave it to Marcus when my time came. I'd worked hard for this quiet life. Those 43 years of teaching weren't just about lesson plans and parent conferences. I'd spent my own money on classroom supplies, stayed late tutoring struggling students, and brought home stories of children who needed extra love. Frank and I had sacrificed family vacations to pay for Marcus's college, skipped restaurant dinners to build our modest savings account, and chosen generic groceries over name brands so we could sock away money for retirement. Now here I was, comfortable but not wealthy, with a routine I cherished. Monday mornings at the farmer's market, Tuesday afternoons at the library, where I volunteered reading to preschoolers, Wednesday evenings playing bridge with my friend Ethel next door. Thursdays I'd drive to the cemetery to bring Frank fresh flowers and tell him about my week. Fridays were for grocery shopping and meal prep. Weekends were mine to garden, read, or simply sit on the porch swing Frank built and watch the world turn without me having to manage any part of it. It was a simple life, but it was carefully constructed, like the classroom environments I'd spent decades perfecting. Every corner of my house had its purpose, every drawer organized exactly how I liked it. The guest bedroom held Frank's old recliner and my sewing machine. The extra bathroom stored my cleaning supplies and seasonal decorations. The basement recreation room housed my collection of puzzles and the exercise bike my doctor insisted I use 3 times a week. Marcus had grown up here, learned to ride his bike on this driveway, brought his high school girlfriends to awkward dinners at this same dining room table. He'd graduated from Penn State with a degree in business, landed a good job at a regional bank, and eventually married Cassandra in a wedding that cost more than Frank and I spent on our first car. I'd been proud of him, proud of the man he'd become, proud that he'd found someone who made him smile. But somewhere along the way, that pride had curdled into something more complicated. Cassandra Walsh had burst into our lives 6 years ago, like a small, perfectly groomed tornado. She was 28 to Marcus's 30, blonde in a way that required monthly maintenance, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Her father Harold owned 3 furniture stores across eastern Pennsylvania. Her mother Dolores had never worked a day in her life, but somehow managed to stay busier than most CEOs. flitting between charity luncheons and country club committees. They were what Frank used to call comfortable people, the kind who'd never had to choose between fixing the car and fixing the roof, who planned vacations a year in advance and bought Christmas gifts in July when they went on sale. Not that there was anything wrong with comfort, but they wore their ease like armor, protective and impenetrable. From the beginning, Cassandra made it clear that she found my life quaint. She'd compliment my vintage kitchen appliances with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for museum exhibits. She'd marvel at how I made do with my small television, how I managed without a cleaning service, how I coped with doing my own grocery shopping instead of having them delivered. During their engagement, she'd suggested I might want to freshen up the house before the wedding photos were taken in my backyard. She brought paint swatches and fabric samples, talked about opening up the space and maximizing natural light. I'd smiled and nodded, then quietly returned the samples to their store the next day. The wedding itself had been a production that made my own simple ceremony 45 years earlier seem like a courthouse afterthought. 5 bridesmaids in dusty rows, a string quartet, and a reception that lasted until midnight. Harold had insisted on paying for everything, which I appreciated, but there was something about the way he handed over his credit card that felt like ownership rather than generosity. Marcus had been happy though, genuinely glowing as he danced with his new wife under lights that probably cost more than my monthly pension. And that happiness was enough for me. I'd raised him to choose love over convenience, even if I sometimes wondered if he'd chosen convenience disguised as love. For the first 2 years of their marriage, things had been pleasant enough. They'd visit every other Sunday for dinner, Cassandra bringing store-bought desserts that she'd arrange on my plates as if she'd baked them herself. She'd update me on their renovations, their vacation plans, their friends' pregnancies and promotions. Marcus would help me with small repairs around the house, and we'd fall into our old rhythm of comfortable conversation. But I'd started to notice small things. The way Marcus deferred to her in every decision, even about which movie to watch or where to go for dinner. The way she'd answer questions I'd asked him directly. The way she'd rearrange things when she thought I wasn't looking, moving my salt and pepper shakers to a better spot on the counter, adjusting my throw pillows to achieve better symmetry. It was like living with someone who was slowly, politely erasing me. Still, I'd told myself these were minor irritations, the normal adjustments that came with welcoming someone new into a family. Cassandra wasn't malicious, just particular. Marcus wasn't weak, just accommodating. They were building a life together, and I was grateful to be included in it, even peripherally. Then came the financial troubles, though I didn't learn about them until much later. It started with small requests. Could they borrow the car while Marcus's was in the shop? Could I watch their cat while they went away for a long weekend? Could Cassandra use my address for a package delivery, since they weren't sure they'd be home? Each request was reasonable, wrapped in appreciation and promises to return the favor. But the requests became more frequent, more significant. They needed to use my garage while their driveway was being repaved. Could they store some furniture in my basement while they decided what to do with Cassandra's grandmother's antiques? Would I mind if they had a few packages delivered here since their apartment mailroom wasn't secure? I said yes to everything because I loved my son and wanted to help. Because saying no felt petty when they were asking for such small things. Because I had space they needed, and what good was space if it couldn't be shared with family? I didn't realize I was being groomed. The truth, which I wouldn't piece together until months later, was that Marcus and Cassandra were drowning in debt. The fancy wedding, the expensive honeymoon, the BMW, the upscale apartment, the designer clothes, the constant dining out, it had all been funded by credit cards and loans they couldn't actually afford. Marcus's bank salary was decent but not extravagant. Cassandra's part-time job at her friend's boutique was more social activity than income source. They'd been living a lifestyle that required Harold's safety net, and when Harold's furniture stores started struggling in the economic downturn, that safety net developed holes. Big ones. But I didn't know any of this on that December afternoon when Cassandra announced her parents were moving in. All I knew was that my quiet, organized life was about to be invaded by people who'd never asked my permission. "It's only temporary," Cassandra said, stepping aside so the movers could bring in a massive leather recliner that wouldn't fit through my front door without tilting it at an alarming angle. 3 months at most. Their contractor promised the condo would be finished by March. Harold appeared beside her, already assessing my living room like a general surveying a battlefield. Nice place, Minnie. Good bones. Could use some updating, but good bones. I stood there in my own foyer, still wearing my Christmas apron, watching strangers rearrange my furniture to make room for theirs. Marcus hung back by the door, hands still in his pockets, looking like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. "Marcus," I said quietly, "can I speak with you privately?" He followed me into the kitchen, leaving Cassandra to direct the furniture placement with the enthusiasm of a Hollywood director. Through the doorway, I could see Harold testing the stability of my coffee table while Dolores examined my family photos with the kind of critical attention usually reserved for fine art authentication. "Mom, I know this is sudden," Marcus began, but I held up my hand. "Sudden would be calling me this morning. This is ambush." He winced. "Cassandra's parents really are having work done on their place. The contractor found some structural issues, and it's going to take longer than they thought. And they couldn't stay in a hotel? Or with Cassandra's sister? Or rent a temporary apartment?" Marcus shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. "It's complicated. They thought this would be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone except me, apparently. But I didn't say that because I could see the stress in my son's face, the way his shoulders hunched forward like he was bracing for impact. Whatever was happening here, Marcus was carrying more weight than he was letting on. From the living room came the sound of my grandmother's china cabinet being moved, followed by Cassandra's voice directing the placement of what sounded like a very large television. I closed my eyes and counted to 10 the way I used to when little Timothy Patterson would have a meltdown during story time. "How long, really?" I asked. 3 months. Maybe 4. "I promise, Mom, we'll help with everything. Groceries, utilities, whatever you need." That should have been my first clue. When people promise to help with expenses before you've even agreed to the arrangement, it usually means they can't actually help with expenses. But I nodded because he was my son, because family helps family, because I'd been raised to believe that opening your home to people in need was simply what decent people did. I nodded because I loved Marcus and trusted that he wouldn't put me in an impossible situation. I was wrong about that last part. By evening, my house had been transformed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harold's massive desk now dominated my dining room, complete with 2 computer monitors and a printer that hummed constantly. Dolores had claimed the guest bedroom and bathroom, spreading her cosmetics across every available surface like she was setting up a department store counter. Their clothes filled my guest closet and spilled into the hallway linen closet. The living room now housed a television roughly the size of my kitchen wall, surrounded by Harold's collection of remote controls and what appeared to be every electronic device ever invented. My careful arrangement of furniture, positioned to encourage conversation and accommodate my arthritis-friendly reading chair, had been pushed aside to create what Harold called a proper entertainment center. Cassandra had taken it upon herself to organize my kitchen, moving my everyday dishes to higher shelves to make room for her parents' better plates. My coffee maker, which had served me faithfully for 12 years, was relegated to the basement because Dolores required a specific European brand that took up half my counter space. "Don't worry," Cassandra assured me as she rearranged my spice rack according to some logic I couldn't follow. "Mom and Dad are very easy house guests. They mostly keep to themselves." This turned out to be spectacularly untrue. Harold, I discovered, was an early riser who believed everyone else should be too. At 6:30 the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of the new coffee machine grinding beans with the enthusiasm of a wood chipper. This was followed by the television news at a volume that suggested Harold's hearing wasn't what it used to be, which was followed by phone calls to his business associates, in voices that carried through my bedroom wall like he was addressing a stadium. By 7, he'd moved his morning routine to my back porch, where he conducted what sounded like heated negotiations with contractors, suppliers, and employees. His voice drifted through my bedroom window, peppered with complaints about lazy workers, unreasonable customers, and the general decline of American work ethic. Dolores, meanwhile, had discovered my kitchen table and claimed it as her personal craft station. When I came downstairs for my own quiet coffee, I found her surrounded by fabric samples, measuring tapes, and what appeared to be plans for redecorating someone's entire house. She looked up from her work with the bright smile of someone who'd found the perfect solution to everyone's problems. "Good morning, Minnie. I hope you don't mind, but I'm helping the Hendersons with their kitchen renovation. I have such a good eye for design, and they just don't know where to start." My kitchen table, which had been Frank's and my place for morning coffee and evening conversations for 30 years, was now completely unusable. Every surface was covered with Dolores's projects, and she'd spread out like someone planning to stay indefinitely. "Of course," I said, pouring my coffee and retreating to the living room, where Harold was now conducting a video conference call while morning show hosts chatted cheerfully in the background. This was day 1. By day 3, I'd lost access to my dining room, my kitchen table, and my living room television during Harold's business hours, which apparently ran from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Dolores had expanded her craft operation to include the kitchen counter, where she was now cutting fabric for what she called a will project that involved enough material to upholster a small hotel. My routines, carefully constructed over 5 years of widowhood, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. I couldn't read in the living room because Harold needed absolute quiet for his calls. I couldn't use the kitchen table for puzzles because Dolores had claimed it for her design work. I couldn't watch my evening programs because Harold controlled the remote and preferred news channels that specialized in shouting. Even my bedroom wasn't safe. Dolores had taken to using the guest bathroom for what she called her beauty routine, which involved enough products to stock a small pharmacy and took up the better part of 2 hours every morning. Since the guest bathroom was directly below my bedroom, I was treated to the sound of hair dryers, curling irons, and what sounded like a small construction project every morning starting at 7. But the worst part wasn't the noise or the lost space, or even the complete disruption of my life. The worst part was the way they settled into my house like they'd always belonged there, like I was the guest who should be grateful for their company. Harold would emerge from his makeshift office in my dining room and comment on my housekeeping. "Minnie, you might want to dust these baseboards more often. Shows the dirt, you know." He'd inspect my mail, offer unsolicited advice about my utility bills, and suggest improvements I could make to increase my property value. Dolores would rearrange my kitchen implements according to her own logic, then act surprised when I couldn't find my own potato peeler. She'd comment on my grocery choices, suggesting I switch to organic produce or buy in bulk to save money. She'd offer to take me shopping for better clothes, as if my comfortable retirement wardrobe was somehow insufficient for my own life. They treated me like a sweet but slightly incompetent, elderly relative, who needed their guidance to function properly. They were gracious about it, always smiling, always grateful, always sure they were helping me become a better version of myself. Marcus came by every few days, bringing takeout dinners and what he probably thought were casual check-ins. But I could see the relief in his face when he found his in-laws comfortably settled, his mother apparently adjusting well to the new arrangement. He'd ask how everyone was getting along, and Harold and Dolores would beam while recounting all the ways they were helping me organize my life. "Your mother is just wonderful," Dolores would tell him, "so accommodating. We're having such a good time getting to know each other better." And Marcus would smile and nod, believing that his decision to allow this invasion had been the right one, that everyone was happy with the arrangement. He couldn't see that I was disappearing in my own home, becoming a supporting character in someone else's story. I didn't complain, because I'd been raised not to make waves, because family was supposed to help family, because Marcus looked so stressed about whatever was weighing on him that I didn't want to add to his burden. I smiled and nodded and made the best of it because that's what good mothers do. But inside, something was building. A quiet anger that grew stronger every morning, when I couldn't drink my coffee at my own kitchen table, every evening when I couldn't watch my programs on my own television, every time Harold offered advice about my own house or Dolores rearranged my own belongings. 3 months, I told myself. I could survive anything for 3 months. What I didn't know was that 3 months was never the real timeline. What I didn't know was that Harold and Dolores weren't renovating their condo at all. They'd lost it to foreclosure 2 months earlier and were desperately trying to keep up appearances while they figured out their next move. What I didn't know was that Marcus and Cassandra were 3 payments behind on their rent and facing eviction themselves. That the BMW was about to be repossessed. That they'd borrowed money from Harold that he didn't actually have, creating a cascade of financial disasters that would eventually crash into my peaceful retirement like a freight train. What I didn't know was that I wasn't helping family through a temporary inconvenience. I was being used as a free solution to other people's bad decisions, a safety net they'd cut out from under me without asking if I was strong enough to hold their weight. But I would learn all of this soon enough. And when I did, I would discover something about myself that I'd forgotten. During all those years of being accommodating, all those decades of putting other people's comfort before my own needs, I would remember that the woman who'd managed a classroom full of challenging children for 43 years, who'd balanced budgets and navigated school politics and stood up to difficult parents and demanding administrators, was still in there somewhere under all that politeness. And she was getting very, very tired of being taken for granted. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 6 weeks after the moving truck had pulled into my driveway. I was trying to make breakfast in my own kitchen while working around Dolores's craft supplies, Harold's coffee empire, and a stack of boxes labeled important papers that had somehow migrated from the basement to my counter space. Ethel had called the night before, worried because she hadn't seen me in weeks. "You missed bridge again," she'd said. "Joan thinks maybe you're avoiding us." I'd had to admit that I was embarrassed to invite anyone over. My house, which had always been neat and welcoming, now looked like a storage unit had exploded in it. Every surface was covered with other people's belongings. Every room had been repurposed for someone else's convenience. "Why don't you come over here for coffee tomorrow?" Ethel had suggested. "We need to catch up." So that Tuesday morning, I was attempting to make a coffee cake to bring to Ethel's, working around Harold's breakfast meeting and Dolores's morning craft session. I'd finally found my mixing bowls behind Harold's protein powder collection, and was measuring flour when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Janet Mitchell, a woman I'd worked with at the school district office during my last 5 years of teaching. She'd moved to Florida after retirement, and we exchanged Christmas cards but rarely talked. "Minnie, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue like this. I'm up visiting my daughter in Philadelphia, and I drove through Millbrook yesterday. I couldn't help but notice there's a for rent sign on Harold Walsh's building downtown." My hands stilled on the mixing bowl. "I'm sorry, what?" "The furniture store. Walsh's Fine Furniture. It's got a big space available for lease sign in the window." I thought that was odd since I know Harold's Cassandra's father. "And didn't you tell me in your Christmas card that she'd married Marcus?" The floor felt unsteady beneath my feet. "Janet, are you sure? Maybe it's just one of his stores, not the main one." "Oh no, honey. This was definitely the main store. The big one on Market Street. The whole building's empty. Looks like it's been closed for a while." I thanked Janet and hung up, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. From the dining room came the sound of Harold's voice, cheerfully discussing delivery schedules with someone. From the kitchen table, Dolores hummed while cutting fabric for her latest project. They'd been living in my house for 6 weeks, claiming their condo was being renovated, while Harold's business had apparently collapsed entirely. I walked very quietly upstairs to my bedroom and closed the door. Then I called the Millbrook Township office and asked to speak to someone about property records. 20 minutes later, I knew the truth. Harold and Dolores Walsh had lost their condo to foreclosure in November. Walsh's Fine Furniture had closed permanently in October, with creditors seizing the inventory and equipment. The family had been living in their car for 2 weeks before Cassandra convinced Marcus to let them move in with me. But they hadn't told Marcus the whole truth either. He thought his in-laws were temporarily displaced by renovation work, not permanently homeless due to financial ruin. I sat on my bed, surrounded by the boxes and bags that had been displaced from the guest room, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something more precise than that. I'd been lied to, not just by Harold and Dolores, but by my own son. Even if he didn't know the full extent of their situation, he'd known enough to realize this wasn't a simple favor between family members. He'd known I was being manipulated, and he'd allowed it to happen because it solved his problem. For the first time in 6 weeks, I felt completely clear about what needed to happen next. I called my attorney. Robert Chen had handled Frank's estate and had been patiently managing my small legal needs for 5 years. He was the kind of lawyer who explained things in plain English and never made me feel foolish for asking questions. "Minnie," he said when his secretary put me through. "How are you? Everything okay?" "Robert, I need to understand my rights regarding house guests who won't leave." There was a pause. "Are we talking about a tenant situation or family members?" "Family members who lied about why they needed to stay here and who have no intention of leaving." "Ah." Another pause. "How long have they been there?" 6 weeks. They claimed it would be 3 months maximum. "And what's the real situation?" I told him everything. Harold's business failure, the foreclosure, the lies about renovation, the complete takeover of my house. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds that I interpreted as either sympathy or professional concern. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Minnie, you're in what we call a guest versus tenant situation. Since they're not paying rent, and there's no formal agreement, they're legally guests. But guests who've been there more than 30 days can claim certain rights, especially if they can prove they've been contributing to household expenses." My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means you can't just change the locks tomorrow. You'll need to give them formal notice to leave, usually 30 days. And if they refuse, you'll have to go through the eviction process." "Eviction? For my own family?" "I'm afraid so. The law doesn't distinguish between family and strangers once someone establishes residency in your home." I felt the walls of my own house closing in around me. "Robert, they've completely taken over my home. I can't use my own kitchen table, I can't watch my own television, I can't have friends over because there's no space. And now you're telling me I have to live like this for at least another month?" "Not necessarily. There might be other options, depending on how creative we want to get." "What kind of options?" "Well, if they've been fraudulent about their circumstances, if they've caused damage to your property, if they violated any local ordinances, there might be faster ways to resolve this." I thought about Harold's constant business calls at all hours, the way he'd moved my furniture without permission, Dolores's craft supplies taking over every surface. What kind of ordinances? Home business operations, for one. If Harold's running a business out of your dining room without proper permits, that could be an issue. Zoning violations, noise complaints, unauthorized modifications to the property. Something sparked in my chest. Not revenge, exactly, but recognition. The same feeling I used to get when a particularly challenging student finally pushed too far and I had to shift from patient teacher to firm authority figure. "Robert, I need you to do something for me. I need a complete background check on Harold and Dolores Walsh, financial records, legal troubles, anything public. And I need to know exactly what my options are for getting them out of my house immediately." "Minnie, are you sure you want to go that route? Legal action against family members can get messy very quickly." I looked around my bedroom, which no longer felt like my sanctuary but like a refugee camp in my own home. "Robert, they've already made it messy. I'm just trying to clean it up." "All right, give me 48 hours. And Minnie, document everything. Take photos of what they've done to your house. Keep records of any conversations about money or timelines. Save any text messages. If this goes legal, you'll want evidence." I hung up and sat very still for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of other people living in my house. Harold's voice carrying through the floor as he argued with someone about a delivery. Dolores moving around in the kitchen, probably reorganizing something else to suit her preferences. Then I got up and walked downstairs to find Harold sitting at my dining room table, surrounded by papers and speaking loudly into his phone. "Excuse me," I said quietly. He held up one finger, indicating I should wait while he finished his conversation. In my own dining room, where he'd set up an office without asking permission. I waited exactly 10 seconds, then walked over and gently but firmly pressed the button to end his call. Harold stared at me, his mouth slightly open. "Minnie, I was in the middle of an important business call." "And I'm in the middle of my own house," I said calmly. "Harold, we need to talk." For the first time since he'd moved in, Harold looked uncertain. Something in my voice, perhaps, or the way I was standing. After 43 years of managing difficult people, I knew how to project authority when I needed to. "Of course," he said, gathering his papers nervously. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by telling me the truth about why you're really here." The color drained from his face so quickly I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean, Walsh's Fine Furniture closed permanently in October. I mean, you lost your condo to foreclosure in November. I mean, there is no renovation, no temporary displacement, and no plan for you to leave my house in the foreseeable future." Harold's papers scattered as his hands began to shake. "Minnie, I can explain. I'm sure you can. But first, I want you to go get Dolores and Marcus, because we're going to have a family meeting, and everyone is going to tell the truth for once." Harold opened his mouth to argue, then looked at my face and apparently thought better of it. Within 10 minutes, we were all gathered in my living room. Dolores perched nervously on the edge of the couch she'd chosen for Harold's entertainment center. Marcus slumped in Frank's old recliner, looking like he wanted to disappear. Harold stood by the window, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I remained standing, positioned where I could see all of them clearly. It was a technique I'd learned in the classroom. Never sit down when you need to maintain authority. "Now," I said in the same tone I'd once used to quiet a room full of restless 8-year-olds. "Someone is going to tell me exactly what's been happening here, the truth this time." The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Mom, I should have told you everything from the beginning." "Yes, you should have, but you can tell me now." And slowly, piece by piece, the whole story came out. Harold's furniture business had been struggling for years, but he'd hidden the problems by borrowing against their condo and his other properties. When the economy tightened, customers stopped buying expensive furniture, and Harold couldn't keep up with his payments. The bank had foreclosed on everything: the stores, the condo, even his personal vehicles. Cassandra had been in denial about her parents' financial collapse, convinced that Harold would find a way to fix everything like he always had. When that didn't happen, she'd panicked. She couldn't let her friends know her family had lost everything, couldn't face the shame of her parents being homeless, so she'd convinced Marcus to let them stay with me temporarily, while she figured out a permanent solution. But there was no permanent solution, because there was no money left to create one. Marcus had known something was wrong, but hadn't pushed for details because he was dealing with his own financial crisis. He and Cassandra were drowning in credit card debt, behind on their rent, and facing their own potential eviction. He'd been too overwhelmed to ask hard questions about his in-laws' situation. "We thought maybe if we all lived here for a while, we could save up enough money to get back on our feet," Marcus said miserably. "I know it's not fair to you, but we didn't know what else to do." I stood there listening to my son explain how he'd planned to use me as a free housing solution for 4 adults in financial crisis, and I felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard clarity. "So let me understand this correctly," I said slowly. "You've all been lying to me for 6 weeks. You've moved into my house under false pretenses. You've completely disrupted my life, taken over my space, and made me a stranger in my own home. And your plan was to continue this indefinitely while you get back on your feet, using my resources." "Mom, we'll pay you back," Marcus said desperately. "As soon as things turn around, we'll make this right." "With what money, Marcus? Harold just told us he's lost everything. You just told us you're behind on your own rent. Cassandra works part-time at a boutique. What exactly are you planning to pay me back with?" "We'll figure it out. We'll get second jobs, we'll sell things, You'll continue to live in my house while you figure it out." Marcus fell silent. I looked around the room at these 4 adults who had decided that my retirement, my peace, my home, were acceptable casualties in their financial war. People I loved, people I'd helped and supported and welcomed into my life, who had repaid that kindness by treating me like a resource to be consumed. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, and my voice was so calm it surprised even me. "You have 72 hours to remove yourselves and all of your belongings from my house." "Mom, please," Marcus started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." Harold and Dolores, you will find alternative housing immediately. I don't care if it's a rental, a shelter, or sleeping in your car. You cannot stay here. Minnie, we have nowhere else to go, Dolores said, tears starting to form in her eyes. You should have thought of that before you lied to me about why you needed to come here in the first place. Marcus and Cassandra, I continued, you will also find somewhere else to live. You're adults with income. Figure it out. But Mom, Marcus said, we can't afford. That's not my problem anymore. You made it my problem without asking permission, and now I'm making it your problem again. The room erupted in protests, please, promises to do better, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about Robert's advice to document everything, about home business violations and zoning ordinances, about the legal weapons I had at my disposal if they refused to leave quietly. 72 hours, I repeated, or I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. You can't do that, Harold said, his voice rising. We're family. You can't just throw family out on the street. I looked at Harold for a long moment, remembering every morning I'd been awakened by his business calls, every evening I'd been shut out of my own living room, every meal I'd eaten standing at my kitchen counter because my table was covered with his wife's craft projects. Harold, I said quietly, family doesn't lie to each other about being homeless. Family doesn't move into someone's house under false pretenses and then act like they own the place. Family doesn't turn someone's dining room into an office without permission and then get indignant when asked to leave. I turned to face all of them, these people who had taken my kindness and twisted it into obligation, who had mistaken my patience for weakness. You stopped treating me like family the moment you decided to use me instead of being honest with me. Now you're house guests who have overstayed your welcome, and house guests can be asked to leave. Minnie, please, Dolores said, reaching for my hand. We're grateful for everything you've done. We know we should have been more upfront about our situation, but we were embarrassed. Pride, you know? Harold's worked so hard his whole life, and to lose everything like this. Her tears were real, and for a moment I felt the familiar tug of sympathy that had gotten me into this situation in the first place. But then I thought about the lie that had brought them here, the way they'd settled into my house like conquerors, the complete absence of any timeline for their departure. Dolores, I understand that losing everything is humiliating. I understand that pride makes it hard to ask for help. But what you did wasn't asking for help. It was taking help without permission and lying about what you needed. We were going to tell you the truth eventually, she said weakly. When? After you'd been here 6 months? A year? When exactly were you planning to admit that this wasn't temporary? She had no answer for that, because there had been no plan to leave. They'd found a comfortable situation and intended to milk it for as long as possible, regardless of what it cost me. Marcus stood up from Frank's chair, his face flushed with what looked like anger. Mom, I can't believe you're being so cold about this. These are desperate people who need help. No, Marcus, these are people who need help and decided to take it from me without asking. There's a difference. They're family. Then why didn't you help them? Why didn't you invite them to stay with you and Cassandra? Why was your solution to move them into my house without discussing it with me first? Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, because of course he and Cassandra couldn't take in Harold and Dolores. Their apartment was too small, their finances too precarious, their lifestyle too carefully constructed around appearances they couldn't afford to maintain. It was easier to volunteer my house, my space, my peace of mind. You have more room, he said finally, which was true but not the point. I have more room because I earned it. I worked for 43 years, saved money, made sacrifices, and paid off this house so I could live comfortably in my retirement. That doesn't make it a homeless shelter for the rest of the family. Cassandra, who had been silent through this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Mrs. Rogers, we never meant for this to become permanent. We really thought Dad would be back on his feet quickly. Based on what? He lost his business months ago, lost his home, lost everything. What exactly did you think was going to change that would put him back on his feet quickly? She didn't have an answer either because there had been no realistic plan, just wishful thinking, combined with the assumption that I would continue to provide free housing while they figured things out. The point is, I continued, you all made decisions about my life without including me in those decisions. You decided I would house 4 extra people indefinitely. You decided I would give up my dining room, my kitchen table, my living room, my quiet mornings, my evening routines. You decided I would pay higher utility bills, buy more groceries, do more laundry, and generally subsidize your financial crisis. We said we'd help with expenses, Marcus protested. With what money? You're behind on your own rent. Harold lost his business. What were you planning to help me with exactly? The silence that followed was telling. They'd made promises they couldn't keep, offered help they couldn't provide, all while assuming I was too polite or too stupid to call them on it. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden, dormant now in the February cold but waiting for spring. Frank and I had planned that garden together, choosing plants that would bloom in sequence from early spring through late fall. It was designed to be beautiful and manageable, just like the life I'd built after his death. 72 hours, I said without turning around. That's not negotiable. And if we don't leave? Harold asked, some of his earlier bluster returning. I turned to face him, and whatever he saw in my expression made him take a step backward. Then I make phone calls. To the zoning office, about your unlicensed home business in my dining room. To the police about trespassing. To Adult Protective Services about elderly financial abuse. To my attorney about formal eviction proceedings. Harold's face went gray. You wouldn't. Try me. The room fell completely silent. Even the hum of Harold's electronics seemed muted, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Mom, Marcus said quietly, I never meant for things to get this bad. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and responsible, who had become someone willing to lie to his own mother to solve his problems. I know you didn't, Marcus. But intentions don't undo consequences. You made choices, and now you have to live with them. We'll leave, Cassandra said suddenly. Marcus, we'll figure something out. We'll find a place. With what security deposit? Marcus asked bitterly. With what first month's rent? We don't have any money left. Then you'll have to borrow it, or earn it, or ask someone else for help. But you won't continue to get it from me under false pretenses. Harold straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim some dignity. Fine, we'll go. But don't expect us to forget this, Minnie. When you're old and need help yourself, remember how you treated family in their time of need. If he'd intended that as a threat, it backfired spectacularly. The idea that these people, who had lied to me and used me and treated my home like their personal hotel, thought they could guilt me with promises of future abandonment, was almost laughable. Harold, I said calmly, if the only way I can get help when I'm older is by letting people lie to me and take advantage of me, then I'll manage on my own. He turned and stomped out of the room, muttering something about ungrateful relatives. Dolores followed him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Cassandra helped Marcus to his feet, and they headed for the door without another word. After they left, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of 6 weeks of invasion. Harold's massive television dominating the wall where my family photos used to hang. Dolores's craft supplies spread across every available surface. The furniture pushed aside to accommodate other people's priorities. For the first time in weeks, the house was completely quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Frank's chair, looking around at the wreckage of my peaceful life. Tomorrow, I would start putting things back where they belonged. Tonight, I would simply enjoy the silence. But first, I had a phone call to make. Robert, it's Minnie Rogers. They'll be leaving in 72 hours. But I want you to file for a restraining order anyway, just in case they try to come back. And I want you to look into whether what they did constitutes elder abuse under Pennsylvania law. Elder abuse? Minnie, that's a serious accusation. Robert, they lied to me about their circumstances, moved into my house under false pretenses, took over my living space, disrupted my life, and planned to continue doing so indefinitely while I subsidized their existence. If that's not financial and emotional abuse of an elderly person, what is? There was a pause while Robert considered this. You might have a point. Financial exploitation of the elderly is a criminal offense in Pennsylvania. So is obtaining housing through fraud. Good. I want them to understand that there are consequences for what they did. Not just for my sake, but because if they'll do this to me, they'll do it to someone else. All right? I'll draft the restraining order and look into the abuse angle. Anything else? I thought about Marcus. About the look of betrayal on his face when I'd refused to continue enabling his poor decisions. Robert, I also want to change my will. Oh? Any particular reason? I want to make sure that if something happens to me, my house goes to someone who will respect it. Someone who won't see it as a free solution to their problems. Minnie, you might want to think about that for a while before making any permanent changes. Family dynamics can be complicated, and sometimes… Robert, my son just spent 6 weeks lying to me about housing 4 people in my home indefinitely. He made decisions about my life without consulting me, allowed strangers to take over my house, and then got angry when I objected. What part of that suggests he would respect my wishes regarding this property? Point taken. We'll schedule a time to review your estate planning. After I hung up, I walked through my house room by room, cataloging the damage. Not just the physical displacement of my belongings, but the emotional violation of my space. Every room held evidence of people who had treated my home like their personal storage unit, who had rearranged my life to suit their convenience. In the dining room, Harold's office setup had left ring stains on my grandmother's table. The weight of his equipment had scratched the hardwood floor. Papers were scattered everywhere, mixed with coffee stains and what looked like food crumbs from meals eaten at my family's gathering place. The kitchen was worse. Dolores had reorganized everything, moving my everyday dishes to shelves I couldn't reach without a step stool, relocating my spices to a system that made no sense to anyone but her. My coffee maker was gone, replaced by her elaborate European machine that took up half the counter and required special filters that cost more than my monthly coffee budget. The living room had been completely transformed into Harold's entertainment center. My carefully arranged furniture was pushed against the walls like afterthoughts. The massive television dominated the space, surrounded by gaming systems, sound equipment, and charging stations for devices I couldn't identify. My family photos had been taken down and stacked in a corner to make room for Harold's business certificates and awards. Even my bathroom showed signs of invasion. Dolores had claimed half the medicine cabinet for her extensive collection of prescription medications, supplements, and beauty products. The shower was clogged with her hair, and my towels had been replaced with her preferred brands. But the worst violation was in my bedroom, where they'd stored boxes and bags that wouldn't fit anywhere else. My personal sanctuary, the one space that should have remained mine, had been turned into overflow storage for their belongings. As I surveyed the damage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. A cold, calculating anger that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with justice. These people had taken advantage of my kindness, lied about their circumstances, and treated my home like a free boarding house. They'd shown no respect for my space, my routine, or my well-being. They'd assumed I was too polite, too old, or too dependent on family relationships to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I called Ethel and asked if she could come over to help me document the state of my house. She arrived within an hour, took one look around, and let out a low whistle. Good Lord, Minnie, what did they do to this place? Exactly what I need you to help me prove. We spent the morning taking photographs of every room, documenting the damage to my furniture, the displacement of my belongings, the complete reorganization of my living space. Ethel, who had been a paralegal before retirement, knew exactly what kind of evidence would be useful in legal proceedings. This isn't just inconsiderate house guests, she said, photographing the scratches on my dining room floor. This is destruction of property. And the way they took over your entire house? That's harassment at minimum. That's what my attorney thinks too. You called Robert? Good. What did he say about getting them out? I told her about the 72-hour ultimatum, the potential charges for elder abuse and fraud, the restraining order we were filing. Ethel nodded approvingly at each step. About time you stopped being so nice to people who don't deserve it. I kept thinking that family was supposed to help family no matter what. Family is supposed to help family, Minnie. But what they did wasn't asking for help. It was taking help. There's a difference. That afternoon, Harold appeared in my kitchen while I was sorting through the mess Dolores had made of my spice cabinet. He looked haggard, older than his 68 years, and I felt a brief flicker of sympathy before remembering why he was there. "Minnie, we need to talk." "We talked yesterday, Harold. You have until tomorrow evening to be out of my house." "That's what I want to discuss. We've been looking for places to stay, but everything requires deposits and first month's rent up front. We just don't have that kind of money right now." I continued organizing my spices, not looking at him. "That's unfortunate, but it's not my problem. Couldn't we work out some kind of arrangement? Maybe we could pay you rent instead of having to find somewhere else." I finally looked up at him. "Harold, you've been here for 6 weeks. Have you paid me a single dollar for groceries, utilities, wear and tear on my house?" "The answer is no, because you don't have money to pay anyone for anything. So how exactly would you pay me rent?" "We could work something out. I could do repairs around the house. Dolores could help with cleaning and cooking." "I don't need repairs, Harold. My house was fine before you moved in and started using my dining room as an office. And I don't need help with cleaning and cooking. I've been managing just fine on my own for 5 years. "But surely—" "Harold, stop. Just stop. You're not offering to help me. You're trying to find a way to continue living here for free while making it sound like you're doing me a favor. The answer is no." His face flushed red. "You're being unreasonable. We're family." "No, Harold, we're not. You're my daughter-in-law's father. That makes you a relative by marriage, not family. Family doesn't lie to each other. Family doesn't take advantage of each other. Family doesn't move into someone's house and act like they own it. We never acted like we owned it." I gestured around the kitchen, where Dolores's craft supplies were still spread across every available surface, where her expensive coffee machine still dominated my counter, where my own dishes were still relegated to shelves I couldn't reach. "Really? Because it looks to me like you've been treating my house like your personal property since the day you arrived." Harold followed my gaze, seeing for perhaps the first time how completely they'd taken over my space. When he looked back at me, some of the fight had gone out of him. "We were just trying to get comfortable. You were trying to make my house into your house, Harold. And you succeeded. But it's not your house, and it never will be. So tomorrow evening, you and Dolores and all of your belongings will be gone. And if we can't find anywhere to go," I met his eyes steadily, "then you'll figure it out, just like everyone else who can't afford their housing does. You'll contact social services, look into emergency shelters, ask other relatives for help. What you won't do is continue to live here." Harold stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. The polite, accommodating woman who had welcomed him into her home was gone, replaced by someone who wouldn't be manipulated or guilted into submission. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll be gone tomorrow. See that you are, because if you're not, the police will help you leave." That evening I heard them moving around upstairs, the sounds of packing and muffled conversations. Part of me felt guilty for being so harsh, but a larger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. My house was going to be mine again. The next day passed slowly. Harold and Dolores moved around my house like ghosts, gathering their belongings and loading them into a rental truck that appeared in my driveway just after lunch. They worked in silence, avoiding eye contact with me, their earlier attempts at manipulation replaced by cold efficiency. Marcus arrived around dinner time to help with the last of their things. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man who had run out of options and was finally facing reality. "Mom," he said quietly as Harold loaded the last of his office equipment into the truck, "I know you're angry with me. I'm disappointed in you, Marcus. There's a difference. I never meant for things to get this out of hand. But they did get out of hand, and instead of fixing the situation, you let it continue because it was easier for everyone else. I thought you were okay with it. You never complained." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and considerate, and wondered when he'd learned to mistake politeness for consent. "Marcus, when have I ever complained about anything? When have I ever made a fuss or demanded attention or insisted that my needs come first? Never. You've always been so easygoing, so accommodating." "Exactly. So the fact that I didn't complain doesn't mean I was okay with what was happening. It means I was being polite while my life was being turned upside down." He winced. I should have checked on you more, should have made sure they weren't overstepping. You should have discussed this with me before agreeing to it in the first place. You should have told me the truth about their situation so I could make an informed decision. You should have set boundaries and timelines and expectations. You're right. I screwed up. Yes, you did. The question is what you're going to do about it. Marcus looked confused. What do you mean? They're leaving, like you wanted. I mean, what are you going to do about the fact that you lied to your mother, manipulated her into housing 4 people indefinitely, and then got angry when she objected? What are you going to do about the fact that you chose your in-laws' comfort over your mother's well-being? Mom, Because right now, Marcus, I don't trust you. I don't trust your judgment. I don't trust your priorities. And I don't trust you to tell me the truth when it's inconvenient for you. The words hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. Marcus's face went pale, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to come to me when he'd broken something, hoping his tears would be enough to earn forgiveness. But I wasn't interested in tears anymore. I was interested in change. What can I do to fix this? He asked quietly. You can start by being honest with me about your own financial situation. You can stop treating me like a solution to problems you don't want to deal with yourself. You can respect the fact that I'm not obligated to sacrifice my comfort for your convenience. And if I do all that, then maybe we can rebuild some trust. But Marcus, it's going to take time. A lot of time. Harold appeared in the doorway, keys in hand. We're ready to go. I nodded. Drive safely. He hesitated as if waiting for me to soften, to offer some final gesture of reconciliation. When none came, he turned and walked out of my house for the last time. Dolores followed him, pausing briefly at the door. Minnie, I hope someday you'll understand that we were just trying to survive. Dolores, I said quietly, I hope someday you'll understand that surviving isn't an excuse for taking advantage of people who love you. She left without another word. Cassandra came last, carrying a box of what looked like kitchen items. She stopped in front of me, her perfect composure finally cracking. Mrs. Rogers, I'm sorry. I know this isn't how families should treat each other. No, it's not. I was just so scared about what would happen to my parents. I thought if I could just buy us some time. Cassandra, buying time with someone else's resources without their permission isn't problem solving. It's theft. She flinched but didn't argue. Will you ever forgive us? I considered the question seriously. I might forgive you, Cassandra. Forgiveness is about letting go of anger, and staying angry takes too much energy. But I'll never trust you again, and I'll never pretend that what you did was acceptable. She nodded and walked out to the truck where her family was waiting. Marcus lingered in my doorway, looking back at the house where he'd grown up, where his father had taught him to throw a baseball and his mother had helped him with homework. I love you, Mom. I love you too, Marcus. But love isn't enough anymore. You need to do better. And then they were gone. I stood in my empty house, listening to the truck drive away, feeling the weight of solitude settle around me like a familiar blanket. For the first time in 6 weeks, the silence was mine again. I walked through each room, seeing my space with new eyes. The dining room, where my grandmother's table could once again be used for meals instead of business meetings. The kitchen, where my coffee maker would be returned to its rightful place. The living room, where my family photos would hang again, where my furniture would be arranged for comfort instead of someone else's entertainment. It would take time to put everything back the way it belonged. But I had time now. I had quiet and space, and the freedom to make decisions about my own life without consulting people who had no respect for my boundaries. That night I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at my kitchen table, which was clear for the first time in 6 weeks. I read a book in my living room, sitting in Frank's chair with my feet up. I took a long bath in my bathroom, using my own towels and my own soap. And for the first time since that December morning when a moving truck had pulled into my driveway, I felt like myself again. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I called Robert Chen and told him that Harold and Dolores had left voluntarily, but that I still wanted to pursue the restraining order and explore the elder abuse charges. Even though they're gone, he asked, especially because they're gone, I wanted on record what they did. And I want legal protection in case they try to come back. But more than that, Robert, I want them to face consequences for their actions. What kind of consequences are you thinking? I want them to understand that what they did was wrong, not just inconvenient for me. I want them to face the legal and financial repercussions of their choices. And I want to make sure they can't do this to someone else. Minnie, pursuing criminal charges against family members is a serious step. Are you sure you want to go down that road? I thought about the 6 weeks of lies, the complete takeover of my house, the assumption that I was too old or too weak or too polite to fight back. Robert, if they had broken into my house and stolen my belongings, would you ask me if I was sure I wanted to press charges? Of course not. Then why is it different because they're related to my daughter-in-law? They obtained housing through fraud. They emotionally manipulated an elderly person. They caused financial damage to my property. The fact that we're related doesn't make their crimes less serious. Point taken. I'll draft the criminal complaint. And Robert? I want to explore a civil suit as well. I want compensation for the damage to my property, the increased utility costs, the groceries I bought to feed 4 extra people, the cost of restoring my house to its original condition. Now you're talking about serious money. Are you sure they have assets to recover? They have Harold's pension, whatever's left in their retirement accounts, probably some life insurance policies. And if they don't have enough to pay me back, then they'll have garnished wages until they do. Minnie, this is going to get expensive and messy very quickly. Good. Maybe if it's expensive and messy enough, they'll think twice before doing this to someone else. Over the next several days, I documented everything I could remember about their stay. The damaged furniture, the increased utility bills, the groceries I'd bought to feed extra people, the cleaning supplies needed to restore my house, the cost of returning my belongings to their original locations. I called my insurance company to report the damage to my dining room floor and asked for an estimate to repair the scratches. I contacted a cleaning service to deep clean my house, particularly the bathroom that Dolores had left in what could charitably be called a distressed condition. I kept receipts for everything. Ethel helped me catalog the financial impact of their stay. 6 weeks of increased grocery bills, higher heating costs because Harold insisted on keeping the house at tropical temperatures, elevated water usage from Dolores's marathon beauty routines, additional internet bandwidth charges from Harold's constant video conferences. They cost you almost $3,000, Ethel calculated after adding up all the receipts and estimates. And that's not counting the emotional distress or the loss of use of your own home. Then that's what they're going to pay me back, plus interest and legal fees. What if they don't have the money? Then they'll get payment plans, garnished wages, whatever it takes. Robert says Pennsylvania law allows for pretty aggressive collection methods in elder abuse cases. You've really thought this through. Ethel, they spent 6 weeks thinking about how to use me. Now I'm going to spend however long it takes thinking about how to get justice. The criminal complaint was filed the following week. Within days, Harold called my house, sputtering with outrage. Minnie, what the hell do you think you're doing? The police want to interview us about elder abuse charges. I'm doing what I should have done the day you lied to me about why you needed to stay here. This is ridiculous. We never abused you. Harold, you obtained housing through fraud, caused damage to my property, emotionally manipulated me, and financially exploited me for 6 weeks. In Pennsylvania, that's textbook elder abuse. We're family. No, Harold, we're not. And even if we were, family doesn't excuse criminal behavior. I can't believe you're doing this to us. We have nowhere else to go. You should have thought of that before you decided to lie to me and use my house as your personal homeless shelter. Minnie, please, can't we work something out? I'll pay you back for whatever you think we owe. With what money? You lost everything, remember? You're broke, homeless, and have no income. How exactly are you planning to pay me back? I'll get a job, You'll face the consequences of your choices, Harold, just like everyone else. This will ruin us. No, Harold. Your own decisions ruined you. I'm just making sure you take responsibility for them. He hung up on me, but not before I heard Dolores crying in the background. I felt no satisfaction in their distress, but I felt no guilt either. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the results. 2 days later, Marcus called. Mom, what have you done? I filed criminal charges against people who defrauded me. What business is it of yours? They're Cassandra's parents. This is destroying her. Marcus. They destroyed my peace of mind for 6 weeks. They can handle a little legal pressure. But the charges are serious. Harold could go to jail. Good. Maybe that will teach him not to lie to elderly women and steal their housing. Mom, please. Can't you just drop the charges? They've learned their lesson. Have they? Because Harold called me yesterday demanding I drop the charges, not apologizing for what he did. That doesn't sound like someone who's learned anything. What do you want from them? I want full restitution for the financial damage they caused. I want them to admit publicly that they defrauded me. I want them to face legal consequences that will prevent them from doing this to someone else. And if they do all that, then maybe I'll consider reducing the charges from felonies to misdemeanors. Maybe. Mom, you're destroying this family. No, Marcus. I'm holding this family accountable for their actions. There's a difference. Cassandra is devastated. She feels like she can't show her face anywhere. Then maybe she'll think twice before helping her parents commit fraud in the future. They were desperate. So are a lot of people, Marcus. That doesn't give them the right to lie to and steal from their relatives. What can I do to fix this? I paused, considering. You can stay out of it. This is between me and them. But surely there's something. Marcus, you helped create this situation by lying to me and allowing them to move in under false pretenses. The last thing I need is more of your help. The silence that followed was painful but necessary. I can't believe you've become this vindictive, he said finally. I haven't become vindictive, Marcus. I've become someone who won't be taken advantage of anymore. If you can't see the difference, that's your problem, not mine. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the choices that had led me to this point. Had I become vindictive? Was I going too far in pursuing legal action against people who were clearly struggling? The answers came to me as I looked around my restored living room, where my family photos hung again in their proper places, where my furniture was arranged for my comfort instead of someone else's convenience. They had counted on my kindness, my politeness, my unwillingness to make waves. They had assumed I would continue to absorb their problems without complaint because that's what I'd always done. But kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling. And I was done enabling people who took advantage of my generosity. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the quiet strength that had carried me through 43 years of teaching, 5 years of widowhood, and 6 weeks of invasion. I was done being anyone's victim. And I was just getting started showing them what that meant. The court date arrived on a crisp Thursday morning in March. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to parent conferences when I needed to project authority with difficult parents. Robert met me at the courthouse steps, carrying a briefcase thick with documentation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we climbed the stone steps. "I've been ready since the day they lied to me about needing somewhere to stay." The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Lawyers whispered to clients, families clustered together for support, and somewhere in that crowd, Harold and Dolores Walsh sat with their court-appointed attorney, looking like they'd aged a decade in the past month. I saw them before they saw me. Harold wore an ill-fitting suit that had probably come from a thrift store, his usual confident bearing replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man who'd finally run out of schemes. Dolores clutched a tissue in her trembling hands, her perfectly maintained appearance now showing the wear of financial stress and legal troubles. When they noticed me approaching, Harold's face hardened into something resembling his old arrogance, but the effect was undermined by the desperate look in his eyes. "Minnie," he said, standing as I passed their bench, "surely we can settle this before we go in there. You've made your point." I stopped and looked at him steadily. "Have I? Because I distinctly remember you telling me that when I was old and needed help, I should remember how I treated family in their time of need." That sounded less like someone who understood they'd done wrong and more like someone making threats. His lawyer, a young woman who looked fresh out of law school, stepped forward. "Mrs. Rogers, my clients are prepared to offer full restitution for any documented expenses you incurred during their stay." "What about the undocumented expenses? The sleep I lost because Harold conducted business calls at 6 in the morning. The stress of being unable to use my own home for 6 weeks? The violation of having my personal space invaded by people who lied about why they needed it? Those are harder to quantify, the lawyer admitted. Then perhaps your clients should have thought about that before they decided to commit fraud. Robert touched my elbow gently. We should go in. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sickly. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of the best principals I'd worked with over the years. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named David Kim, laid out the charges methodically: elder abuse, housing fraud, destruction of property, financial exploitation. Each charge was supported by photographs, receipts, witness statements, and documentation that painted a clear picture of systematic deception and manipulation. Harold and Dolores's lawyer tried to frame their actions as a misunderstanding between family members, a temporary arrangement that had gone on longer than intended due to unfortunate circumstances. She painted them as elderly victims themselves, displaced by economic hardship and forced to rely on family generosity. But Robert had done his homework. He presented evidence of Harold's business practices, including complaints from customers about fraudulent sales tactics and unpaid debts stretching back years. He showed the court documentation of their foreclosure, proving they'd been lying about their circumstances from the beginning. Your Honor, Robert said, addressing the judge directly, this wasn't a family helping family in a time of crisis. This was a calculated scheme to obtain free housing through deception. The defendants researched my client's financial situation, identified her as a vulnerable target, and manipulated family relationships to gain access to her home. Objection, Harold's lawyer said. There's no evidence of calculation or targeting. Actually, there is. Robert pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. Phone records show that the defendants made multiple calls to Marcus Rogers in the weeks before their eviction, discussing his mother's living situation and financial stability. Text messages between Cassandra Walsh Rogers and her mother detail plans to convince Mrs. Rogers to house her parents by lying about the reasons they needed accommodation. Quote, my stomach dropped. Marcus had discussed my finances with Harold. Cassandra had texted about manipulating me. Judge Hendricks reviewed the documents with the expression of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human selfishness. Mr. Walsh, Mrs. Walsh, do you understand the charges against you? Harold stood slowly, his earlier defiance replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. Yes, Your Honor. And how do you plead? There was a long pause. Harold's lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear, but he shook his head. Guilty, Your Honor. We're guilty. Dolores burst into tears, not the delicate dabbing she'd done in my living room, but deep, body-shaking sobs that echoed through the courtroom. Harold put his arm around her, and for a moment I remembered that despite everything they'd done, they were still two elderly people who'd lost everything and made terrible choices trying to survive. But sympathy didn't erase accountability. Judge Hendricks nodded grimly. Given your age and lack of prior criminal record, I'm inclined toward a sentence that emphasizes restitution and community service rather than incarceration. However, the deliberate nature of your deception and the vulnerability of your victim make this a serious matter. She sentenced Harold to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution to me for documented expenses, plus punitive damages. Dolores received 12 months of probation, 150 hours of community service, and joint responsibility for restitution. The total amount came to $8,400 plus court costs and legal fees. Furthermore, Judge Hendricks continued, you are both prohibited from contacting Mrs. Rogers directly or indirectly for the duration of your probation. Any attempt to contact her through family members, friends, or third parties will result in immediate incarceration. As the court adjourned, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it felt more like closing a wound than healing one. Harold and Dolores were escorted out by their probation officer, leaving me alone with Robert in the courtroom that was already filling with the next case's participants. How do you feel? Robert asked as we gathered our papers. Like I've done what I had to do. Any regrets? I considered the question honestly, only that it came to this in the first place. But no, I don't regret holding them accountable. Outside the courthouse, the March air carried the promise of spring. As Robert and I walked toward our cars, I noticed a familiar figure leaning against a lamppost across the street. Marcus. He'd been in the courtroom, sitting in the back where I couldn't see him, watching his mother send his in-laws to criminal court. When he saw me notice him, he straightened and crossed the street. "Mom." "Marcus, I didn't know you were here. Cassandra asked me to come. She thought maybe if I talked to you." "There's nothing to talk about, Marcus. It's over." "Is it? Because Cassandra's parents are ruined now. They'll never be able to find decent housing with criminal records. Harold's too old to find work that will pay enough for restitution. This is going to destroy what's left of their lives." I looked at my son, this man who still somehow thought his mother was responsible for fixing other people's bad decisions. "Marcus, they destroyed their own lives when they chose to lie and steal instead of asking for help honestly. I didn't put them in this situation. They did. But you could have chosen mercy. I chose justice. There's a difference. What about forgiveness? What about turning the other cheek? I forgave them for lying to me. I forgave them for taking over my house. I forgave them for treating me like a free hotel. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending their actions didn't have consequences." Marcus's face crumpled slightly, and I saw the little boy who used to come to me when he'd made mistakes, looking for absolution without accountability. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now they learn to live with the results of their choices, just like everyone else." "I meant what happens with us, with our family." I studied my son's face, seeing Frank's eyes and my own stubborn chin, but also seeing the weakness that had led him to enable Harold and Dolores's deception. "That depends on you, Marcus. Are you going to continue choosing other people's comfort over my well-being? Are you going to keep treating me like a resource to be managed instead of a person to be respected? I never meant to. It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did. And what you did was lie to me, manipulate me, and then get angry when I refused to continue being victimized. So what do I have to do to fix this? You have to decide who you want to be, Marcus. Do you want to be someone who takes responsibility for his mistakes and learns from them? Or do you want to be someone who blames others when his poor decisions have consequences? I want to fix this. Then start by being honest about your finances, about your marriage, about the choices you've made that led to this situation. Stop trying to manage me and start managing yourself." Marcus nodded, but I could see the resistance in his eyes. He wanted a quick solution, a way to smooth things over, and return to the comfortable dynamic where his problems became my problems. "It's going to take time," I continued. "A lot of time. And it's going to require you to change in ways that might be uncomfortable. Are you willing to do that?" "I think so." "Then prove it. Not with words, but with actions. Show me over time that you've learned something from this experience. Show me that you can respect boundaries and tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. And if I do that, then maybe we can rebuild our relationship. But Marcus, it will never be the same as it was before. I will never again assume that you have my best interests at heart. You'll have to earn that trust back." We stood there on the courthouse steps, two people who loved each other but no longer quite knew how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Marcus. But love isn't enough anymore. You need to do better." He nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with Robert on the steps of a building where I'd just watched my son's in-laws plead guilty to defrauding me. "You okay?" Robert asked. "I will be." And for the first time in months, I actually believed that was true. The restitution payments began arriving the following month. Harold had found work at a furniture warehouse, loading trucks for minimum wage. Dolores was cleaning offices at night, her manicured hands now cracked and raw from industrial cleaning supplies. Their combined income barely covered their own basic expenses, so the payments to me were small and irregular. But they came. $50 here, $35 there, each check a reminder that actions have consequences and debts must be paid. I deposited each payment into a separate account, not because I needed the money, but because the principle mattered. They had cost me financially and emotionally, and they needed to understand that their choices had real impacts on real people. By summer, I'd settled into a new routine. My house was fully restored, my space arranged exactly as I wanted it. The scratches in my dining room floor had been repaired, the damage to my furniture fixed or replaced. Every trace of Harold and Dolores's invasion had been erased, except for the lessons it had taught me. I'd also made some changes that wouldn't have occurred to me before their unwelcome visit. I had new locks installed, ones that couldn't be easily duplicated. I updated my will to include specific language about who could and couldn't live in my house, and under what circumstances. I even installed a security system, something that had never seemed necessary in quiet Millbrook Township. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own instincts again. To say no when something didn't feel right. To prioritize my own well-being instead of automatically accommodating everyone else's needs. The transformation wasn't dramatic. I was still the same person who'd taught elementary school for 4 decades. Still the woman who brought casseroles to sick neighbors and volunteered at the library. But underneath that familiar exterior was a steel core that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there and just needed to be awakened. Ethel noticed the change immediately. "You're different," she said over coffee one Tuesday morning in June. "Stronger somehow. I feel different, more sure of myself." "Good. You were getting a little too accommodating there for a while. Frank would be proud of how you handled those people." "I think he would have handled it better. He never would have let them move in the first place." "Maybe, but you handled it your way and it worked out fine. Better than fine, actually. You sent a message that you're not to be trifled with." "Is that what I did?" "Minnie, honey, you took a family that was used to getting their way through manipulation and lies, and you showed them that there are still people in this world who won't be pushed around. That's no small thing." As summer turned to fall, Marcus began making tentative overtures toward reconciliation. He'd call once a week, not asking for anything, just checking in. He'd stop by occasionally to handle small maintenance tasks around the house, work I could have done myself or hired someone to do. But gestures I recognized as his way of trying to rebuild trust. He never mentioned Harold and Dolores, and I never asked about them. Cassandra had apparently been devastated by her parents' criminal conviction and had distanced herself from them entirely, which created its own family drama that Marcus was trying to navigate. But that wasn't my problem anymore. In October, Marcus showed up at my door looking haggard and carrying what appeared to be legal documents. "Mom, can we talk?" I led him into my kitchen, noting how he paused at the threshold, as if asking permission to enter my space. It was a small thing, but it showed awareness that hadn't been there before. "What's going on?" "Cassandra filed for divorce." I poured coffee and waited for him to continue. "She says she can't handle the shame of her parents' conviction, and she blames me for not stopping you from pressing charges." "I see. She's asking for half of everything. The house, my retirement account, even my car. What does your lawyer say?" "That she's probably entitled to it under Pennsylvania law, even though we were only married for 6 years. I sipped my coffee and studied my son's face. He looked older, worn down by stress and consequences that had finally caught up with him. "I'm sorry your marriage is ending, Marcus." "Are you? Really?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be unhappy." "But you're not sorry about what happened to Harold and Dolores." "No, I'm not. They made their choices and faced the consequences. That's how the world is supposed to work." "Even if it destroyed my marriage?" I set down my coffee cup and looked at my son directly. "Marcus, your marriage wasn't destroyed by me pressing charges against people who defrauded me. Your marriage was destroyed by the choices you and Cassandra made. The lies you told, the manipulation you enabled, the complete disregard you showed for my well-being. But if you had just let them stay, if I had just let them stay, they would still be in my house right now. You and Cassandra would still be living beyond your means, and nothing would have changed except that I would have continued to be their victim." "So you have no regrets about any of this?" I considered the question carefully. "I regret that it happened at all. I regret that people I loved chose to lie to me and use me. I regret that you prioritized your in-laws' comfort over your mother's dignity. But I don't regret holding them accountable. And I don't regret refusing to continue being taken advantage of. Marcus slumped in his chair, looking defeated. What am I supposed to do now? You're supposed to learn from this experience and make better choices going forward. That's not very helpful, Mom. Marcus, I'm not your problem solver anymore. I'm not going to fix your divorce, or help you manage your finances, or provide solutions to problems you created. I'm your mother, and I love you, but I'm not responsible for your life. So you're just going to watch me struggle? I'm going to watch you grow up. Finally. The words hung in the air between us, harsh but necessary. Marcus had spent his entire adult life expecting someone else to smooth out his difficulties, to provide safety nets for his poor decisions. First his parents, then his wife's parents, then me again when things got desperate. But safety nets only work if the person using them eventually learns to fly on their own. I don't know how to do this by myself, he admitted quietly. Then you'll learn. The same way everyone else does. Through trial and error. Through making mistakes and fixing them yourself. Through taking responsibility for your own choices. What if I can't? Then you'll fail and you'll pick yourself up and try again. That's what adults do, Marcus. He left that afternoon without asking for help, without expecting me to solve his problems, without assuming I would provide the emotional support he'd always taken for granted. It was a small step, but it was progress. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came news that Harold Walsh had suffered a heart attack. He survived, but the medical bills combined with his existing restitution obligations pushed him and Dolores into bankruptcy. I felt no satisfaction in their continued misfortune, but I felt no guilt either. They were facing the natural consequences of decades of poor financial decisions, complicated by their recent criminal conviction. None of that was my responsibility. Marcus called to tell me about Harold's heart attack, perhaps expecting me to express sympathy or offer to help with medical expenses. That's unfortunate, I said. I hope he recovers fully. That's it? That's all you have to say? What else would you like me to say, Marcus? I don't know. Something more compassionate, maybe? I'm not uncompassionate, Marcus. I hope Harold gets better, and I hope he and Dolores find a way to stabilize their lives. But their problems are not my problems anymore. They're family. No, they're not. They're people who committed crimes against me and are now facing the consequences. The fact that they're related to your ex-wife doesn't create any obligation on my part to help them. Ex-wife? The divorce was finalized last week, wasn't it? Marcus was quiet for a moment. How did you know? Because you're calling me about Harold's heart attack instead of dealing with your own life. You only focus on other people's problems when your own problems feel too big to handle. That's not fair. Marcus, when is the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When is the last time you asked about my life, my health, my interests? When is the last time you treated me like a person instead of a resource? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. I don't know, he said finally. Then maybe that's something to think about. Spring returned to Millbrook Township with the usual flourish of daffodils and cherry blossoms, but this year felt different. My garden, which Frank and I had designed together 40 years earlier, bloomed with new purpose. I'd spent the winter planting additions, new flower beds, and walking paths that reflected my current needs rather than compromises with someone else's preferences. I'd also made new friends, people I'd met through volunteer work at the Literacy Center and the Senior Center. Women who had their own stories of overcoming disappointment and finding strength in unexpected places. Men who understood that being widowed didn't mean being helpless. My social calendar, once empty except for family obligations, now included book clubs and hiking groups and monthly dinners with people who valued my company for its own sake rather than what I could provide for them. The restitution payments continued, smaller now due to Harold's medical expenses and reduced work capacity, but still arriving monthly like clockwork. The account where I deposited them had grown to nearly $4,000. Money I'd decided to donate to a legal aid society that helped elderly people fight financial abuse. It seemed fitting that Harold and Dolores's payments would eventually help other people avoid what I'd gone through. Marcus had found his footing somewhat after the divorce. He'd moved into a small apartment, taken a second job to cover his new expenses, and begun what appeared to be genuine efforts to manage his own life without expecting others to solve his problems. Our relationship remained cautious, but was slowly improving. He'd learned to call before visiting, to ask before assuming I'd provide help or advice, to respect the boundaries I'd established. It wasn't the easy closeness we'd once shared, but it was healthier. One afternoon in May, he surprised me by bringing lunch and asking if I wanted to eat on the porch. "This is nice," I said as we settled into the wicker chairs Frank had bought 20 years earlier. "I've been thinking about what you said. About how I never ask about your life anymore." "Oh? So I'm asking, how are you doing, Mom? Really doing?" I looked out at my garden, where the lilacs were just beginning to bloom, where everything was arranged exactly as I wanted it, where no one could move my furniture or rearrange my belongings or turn my dining room into an office without permission. "I'm doing well, Marcus. Better than I have in years, actually." "You seem different. More confident, maybe?" "I feel more like myself than I have since your father died. It took me a while to figure out who I was without him. And then Harold and Dolores showed up, and I lost myself again for a while. But now I know." "Know what?" "Know that I don't need anyone else's permission to live my life the way I want to live it. Know that I don't have to sacrifice my comfort for other people's convenience. Know that being kind doesn't mean being a doormat." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to learn some of those same lessons." "Good. It's never too late to figure out who you really are." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching birds visit the feeders I'd hung from the maple tree. It wasn't the same relationship we'd had before, but it was honest in a way it had never been previously. "Mom," Marcus said eventually, "I owe you an apology. A real one." "For what specifically?" "For putting Harold and Dolores' needs ahead of yours. For lying to you about their situation. For treating your house like a family resource instead of your private home. For getting angry when you stood up for yourself. And for never asking what you wanted or needed. For assuming you'd always be available to solve other people's problems. For taking advantage of your kindness." I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for over a year. "Thank you. That means a lot. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. And I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Even though it cost Harold and Dolores their freedom and damaged your marriage, especially because of that, you showed all of us that actions have consequences, even when they're committed by family members. That was a lesson we all needed to learn." We finished lunch and Marcus helped me clear the dishes, but he didn't linger the way he used to, waiting for me to offer solutions to whatever problems he was facing. He hugged me goodbye and drove away, leaving me alone on my porch with my thoughts and my garden and my hard-won peace. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Cassandra stood at my front door looking nothing like the polished woman who had once rearranged my spice cabinet without permission. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a modest sweater. "Mrs. Rogers, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see." "What can I do for you, Cassandra?" I wanted to apologize, face to face, not through Marcus or a lawyer or anyone else. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what my parents did to you, and for my part in making it happen. I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this visit after more than a year of silence. "How are you?" I asked as we settled in my living room. "I'm learning to manage on my own. I got a full-time job, found my own apartment, started seeing a therapist to figure out why I thought it was okay to manipulate people I claimed to love." "And what did you discover?" "That I was raised to believe that family loyalty meant enabling bad behavior. That I thought love meant never holding people accountable for their mistakes. That I was so terrified of my parents' disapproval that I helped them hurt you instead of standing up for what was right." Cassandra's honesty was surprising. The woman sitting in my living room bore little resemblance to the entitled princess who had once moved her parents into my house without asking. "Where are your parents now?" "In a senior housing complex about an hour from here. Dad's disability income covers the rent, and Mom works part-time at a grocery store. They're struggling, but they're making it." "And how do you feel about that?" Sad that it came to this, but not angry at you anymore. They made their choices, and you made yours. You chose to protect yourself instead of enabling them, and that was the right choice, even though it was hard for everyone. What about the restitution payments? They're still making them. It'll take them years to pay off what they owe you, but they're committed to it. Dad says it's the least they can do after what they put you through. I studied Cassandra's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse. What do you want from me, Cassandra? Nothing. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you did what you did, and I wanted to thank you. Thank me? For teaching me that enabling people doesn't help them. For showing me that real love sometimes means saying no. For demonstrating that it's possible to be kind without being a victim. Those are hard lessons to learn. They are. But I needed to learn them. My marriage to Marcus might have survived if I'd learned them sooner. Do you regret the divorce? Cassandra considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. But I don't regret ending a relationship that was built on financial dishonesty and family manipulation. Marcus and I both needed to grow up, and we couldn't do that together. He seems to be doing better on his own. He is, and so am I. Funny how that works. After Cassandra left, I sat in my quiet house and reflected on the year that had passed since Harold and Dolores first invaded my peaceful retirement. So much had changed. Not just in the obvious ways, but in subtle shifts that had transformed how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was no longer the accommodating widow who automatically said yes to every request for help. I was no longer the woman who absorbed other people's problems without question. I was no longer someone who could be manipulated through guilt or family obligations. But I also wasn't bitter or hardened by the experience. I still volunteered at the literacy center, still brought soup to sick neighbors, still opened my home to people I cared about. The difference was that now I did these things by choice rather than obligation, with boundaries rather than blind generosity. The woman who had once painted seashells in her kitchen while her world was slowly being taken over by manipulative relatives was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more aware of her own worth. As summer approached, I began planning a celebration. Not a party exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement of the year that had changed everything. I would invite Ethel and my new friends from the book club. We would eat dinner at my dining room table, the one Harold had turned into his office, but which now hosted only conversations I wanted to have with people I chose to include in my life. It would be a celebration of survival, of growth, of the strength that emerges when someone finally stops asking permission to protect themselves. The invitations I sent were simple. Join me for dinner to celebrate the most difficult year of my life and how much I learned from it. Because that's what it had been. Difficult, painful, transformative, and ultimately necessary. I had learned that family was something you chose, not something you were obligated to enable. I had learned that kindness without boundaries was cruelty to yourself. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue people from the consequences of their own choices. Most importantly, I had learned that I was strong enough to stand alone when standing with others required compromising my integrity. The restitution payments would continue for years, a monthly reminder of the cost of deception and the value of accountability. Harold and Dolores would struggle financially for the rest of their lives, carrying the burden of their criminal conviction and the practical consequences of their poor choices. Marcus would continue rebuilding his life, hopefully with greater wisdom and honesty than before. Cassandra would forge her own path, free from the toxic family dynamics that had shaped her earlier decisions. And I would continue living in my house, my sanctuary, my space arranged exactly as I wanted it, surrounded by people who valued my company for its own sake, rather than what I could provide for them. It wasn't the retirement I had planned, but it was the life I had earned. And finally, after 73 years on this earth, I was living it entirely on my own terms. 2 years had passed since the courthouse steps, since the restitution payments began arriving like clockwork, since I'd reclaimed my home and my sense of self. I thought the chapter was closed, filed away in the category of difficult experiences that teach valuable lessons. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a humid Tuesday morning in July. I was watering my tomatoes when the kitchen phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful morning sounds of birdsong and distant lawnmowers. "Mrs. Rogers, this is Detective Sarah Mitchell with the Millbrook Township Police Department. I'm calling about Harold and Dolores Walsh." My hand tightened on the watering can. "What about them?" "They've been arrested again, ma'am. We'd like to speak with you about some additional charges that may be related to your previous case." The water from my watering can pooled around the tomato plants as my mind struggled to process this information. Additional charges? Housing fraud, elder abuse, identity theft. It appears the Walshes have been running the same scheme they used on you, but on a much larger scale. Could you come down to the station sometime today? I set down the watering can with shaking hands. Of course, I'll be there this afternoon. The police station smelled like coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Mitchell was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much human nature at its worst. She led me to a small conference room where files were spread across a table like evidence of a complex puzzle. "Mrs. Rogers, thank you for coming in. I know this must be overwhelming." "What exactly have they done now?" Detective Mitchell opened the first file. "After their conviction in your case, Harold and Dolores moved to Riverside County. Within 6 months, they'd convinced an elderly widower named Frank Chen to let them move into his house while their, quote, insurance settlement was being processed." I stared at the photograph of a frail-looking Asian man in his 80s. "How long were they there?" 8 months. They told Mr. Chen they'd been displaced by a house fire and were waiting for their insurance company to release funds for temporary housing. Mr. Chen, who had recently lost his wife and was struggling with dementia, believed them completely. What happened to him? He died last month. Heart failure brought on by stress. But before he died, he gave his caregiver a box of documents that included rental agreements, utility bills, and grocery receipts, showing that Harold and Dolores had been charging him for everything while living in his house for free. Detective Mitchell opened another file. Then there's Margaret Williams, a 78-year-old woman in Pine Ridge. The Walshes convinced her they were her late husband's business partners and that he'd promised them temporary housing while they sorted out financial difficulties related to his death. The photograph showed a confused-looking woman with silver hair and frightened eyes. They told her that her husband had guaranteed them accommodation, and she was too grief-stricken to question it. They lived in her house for 5 months, convinced her to add them to her bank account so they could help manage her finances, and systematically drained her savings. How much did they take? $34,000, her entire retirement fund. I felt sick. Are there others? Detective Mitchell nodded grimly. We've identified at least 6 victims over the past 18 months, all elderly, all recently widowed or dealing with health issues that made them vulnerable to manipulation. The Walshes had refined their technique since your case. They researched obituaries, identified potential targets, and crafted specific stories designed to exploit each victim's particular vulnerabilities. She spread out more photographs, more files, more evidence of systematic predation. They would move in under false pretenses, establish themselves as indispensable helpers, then gradually take control of their victims' finances and living situations. In every case, they claimed to be temporary guests who would leave as soon as their supposed financial problems were resolved. But how did they keep getting away with it? Because their victims were isolated, confused, or too ashamed to admit they'd been taken advantage of. Frank Chen's family lived across the country and rarely visited. Margaret Williams had no close relatives. The other victims were similarly isolated. Detective Mitchell leaned back in her chair. You were different, Mrs. Rogers. You were lucid, you had legal representation, and most importantly, you fought back. Your case provided the legal precedent we needed to build charges against them for their other victims. What kind of charges? Elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, money laundering. The district attorney thinks we can make conspiracy charges stick as well, given the systematic nature of their operation. I stared at the files spread across the table. each one representing an elderly person who had been violated in their own home by people they'd trusted. People like me, but without the resources or support system that had allowed me to fight back. What do you need from me? Your testimony, primarily. Your case established their pattern of behavior. We need you to explain to a jury how their scheme works, how they manipulate their victims, how they establish credibility and exploit trust. Will I have to face them in court again? Yes, but this time will be different. This time you'll be helping to protect other potential victims. This time you'll be speaking for people who can't speak for themselves. I thought about Frank Chen, dying alone while the people he'd helped systematically exploited his kindness. I thought about Margaret Williams, her life savings stolen by criminals who'd convinced her they were helping honor her husband's memory. When do you need me to testify? The trial starts in September. But Mrs. Rogers, I should warn you that this is going to be much more intense than your previous experience. The defense will try to portray you as vindictive, as someone who has a personal vendetta against the defendants. They'll argue that you're an unreliable witness because of your prior legal action against them. Let them try. Detective Mitchell smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. I had a feeling you'd say that. Over the next several weeks, I worked closely with the prosecution team to prepare my testimony. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Torres was a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in elder abuse cases. She helped me understand how my experience fit into the larger pattern of Harold and Dolores's criminal enterprise. They're not just opportunistic criminals, she explained during one of our preparation sessions. They're sophisticated predators who specifically target vulnerable elderly people. They study their victims, research their backgrounds, and craft elaborate deception schemes designed to exploit specific emotional vulnerabilities. But why elderly people specifically? Because elderly people are often isolated, trusting, and reluctant to involve law enforcement when things go wrong. They're embarrassed about being taken advantage of, worried about losing their independence, and often have complex family dynamics that criminals can exploit, like they did with Marcus. Exactly. They researched your family situation, identified your son as a pressure point, and used his financial troubles to gain access to you. When that worked, they refined the technique for future victims. Rebecca showed me evidence that chilled me to the bone. Harold and Dolores had kept detailed notes about their victims, recording personal information, financial details, and emotional vulnerabilities like hunters tracking prey. They had files on each victim, Rebecca explained, showing me photocopied pages from Harold's notebooks. Physical descriptions, health conditions, family relationships, financial assets. They even noted which victims were most susceptible to guilt manipulation versus fear tactics. I stared at a page that appeared to be about me. Minnie Rogers, 72, widow, retired teacher. Son Marcus in financial trouble, relationships strained, house paid off, modest pension, savings unknown. Polite, accommodating, avoids confrontation. Target through family obligation angle. Seeing myself reduced to a criminal's assessment was deeply unsettling, but it also clarified something important. This hadn't been a desperate family taking advantage of an unexpected opportunity. This had been a calculated attack by professional predators. How long had they been doing this? We think they started small-scale financial crimes about 5 years ago, when Harold's business began failing. They probably began with insurance fraud, loan applications with false information, that sort of thing. But after they lost everything, they escalated to targeting elderly victims directly. And my case? Your case was probably their first attempt at long-term housing fraud. When it worked temporarily, they realized they'd found a viable criminal enterprise. If you hadn't fought back, they would have continued living in your house indefinitely while looking for additional victims to exploit. The weight of this information settled on me like a heavy blanket. My decision to pursue legal action hadn't just been about personal justice. It had potentially prevented years of additional victimization. As the trial date approached, I received unexpected visitors. Marcus appeared at my door one evening, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize. "Mom, this is Janet Kim. She's the daughter of Frank Chen." Janet was a small woman in her 50s with her father's kind eyes and an expression of deep sadness. "Mrs. Rogers, I wanted to thank you for what you did." If you hadn't pressed charges against Harold and Dolores after they defrauded you, my father might have suffered alone until he died. We sat in my living room, the same space where I'd confronted Harold and Dolores 2 years earlier, while Janet told me about her father's final months. Dad was always so independent, so proud. When he started showing signs of dementia, he tried to hide it from us. We live in California, and we only visited once or twice a year. We had no idea strangers were living in his house. How did you find out? His caregiver, Maria, became suspicious when Harold started answering the phone and making financial decisions for Dad. She contacted us, and when we investigated, we discovered the whole scheme. Janet's voice broke slightly. They had convinced Dad that they were helping him, that they were taking care of the house and managing his affairs as a favor. He was paying for their groceries, their utilities, their medical expenses. He thought he was helping family friends, not being robbed by criminals. Marcus leaned forward. Mom. Janet wanted to understand how this happened, how they operate. I told her about what happened to you and how you handled it. The police say your case was crucial to building charges against them, Janet continued. That you established their pattern of behavior and provided evidence of their systematic targeting of elderly victims. I'm just sorry I couldn't prevent what happened to your father. You couldn't have known they would continue their crimes elsewhere. But by fighting back, you created a legal record that allowed us to seek justice for Dad and the other victims. Janet reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. This is Dad with my mother, taken about 5 years ago. Before the dementia, before he became vulnerable to people like Harold and Dolores. The photograph showed a vibrant elderly couple, clearly in love, clearly content. It reminded me of pictures of Frank and me from our later years together. Your father looks like he was a wonderful man. He was. He spent his whole life helping people. He was a doctor, volunteered at free clinics, never turned away a patient who couldn't pay. The fact that criminals were able to exploit his kindness in his final months. Janet's voice trailed off. I understand. It's the violation of trust that hurts the most. Yes, exactly. Dad trusted them because he was raised to believe that people are fundamentally good, that if someone needs help, you help them. Harold and Dolores weaponized that goodness against him. After Janet and Marcus left, I sat alone in my quiet house and thought about the ripple effects of Harold and Dolores's crimes, not just the financial damage or the violation of homes and privacy, but the deeper wound to the victim's ability to trust their own judgment, to believe in human decency. Frank Chen had died thinking he was helping friends, never knowing he'd been systematically robbed. Margaret Williams would spend the rest of her life questioning every interaction, every offer of help, wondering if people were being kind or looking for opportunities to exploit her. The trial began on a September morning that was crisp, with the promise of autumn. The courthouse was the same building where I'd watched Harold and Dolores plead guilty to defrauding me, but this time the stakes were much higher. Harold and Dolores entered the courtroom looking like different people than the defendants I'd faced 2 years earlier. Harold had lost weight, his face gaunt, and his hands shaking with what might have been early Parkinson's disease. Dolores appeared even more fragile, her hair gray and thinning, her expensive clothes replaced by a simple dress that hung loosely on her diminished frame. But when their eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw the same entitlement, the same resentment that had been there when I'd ordered them out of my house. They blamed me for their downfall, for the consequences that had followed their choices to continue committing crimes. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Rebecca Torres presented evidence of systematic predation. The research files Harold had kept on victims, the fake identification documents they'd used to establish credibility, the bank records showing how they'd drained victims' accounts. She called witnesses from each of Harold and Dolores's other crimes. Maria Gonzalez, Frank Chen's caregiver, testified about watching Harold gradually take control of her patient's life, while convincing the old man he was being helped rather than robbed. Detective Williams from Pine Ridge testified about finding Margaret Williams alone in her house after Harold and Dolores had disappeared with her savings, confused and terrified, unsure of what had happened to her money or why the people she'd trusted had suddenly vanished. When it was my turn to testify, I felt calmer than I'd expected. This wasn't about my personal grievances anymore. This was about justice for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Rebecca Torres guided me through my testimony with questions that allowed me to tell the story chronologically. The lies Harold and Dolores had told about needing temporary housing. The way they'd taken over my house without permission. The systematic manipulation of family relationships to maintain access to their victim. Mrs. Tweoy Rogers, Rebecca asked, looking back on your experience, do you see similarities between what happened to you and what happened to the other victims in this case? Yes. The pattern is almost identical. False claims about temporary displacement, elaborate stories designed to evoke sympathy, gradual takeover of the victim's living space and finances, and promises to leave that are never honored. In your opinion, was this opportunistic behavior or something more calculated? Calculated, definitely. No one accidentally creates fake rental agreements, forges insurance documents, and researches their victims' family relationships. This was a planned criminal enterprise. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed overwhelmed by the evidence against his clients, tried to portray me as a vindictive woman with a personal grudge against Harold and Dolores. Mrs. Rogers, isn't it true that you've been pursuing these charges for 2 years because you can't forgive your daughter-in-law's parents for their financial difficulties? No, that's not true. I pursued charges because they committed crimes against me. The fact that they continued committing the same crimes against other elderly victims proves that my decision to seek legal action was correct. But you could have handled this as a family matter, couldn't you? You could have simply asked them to leave without involving law enforcement. I did ask them to leave. They refused. They had established residency in my home through fraud, and they had no intention of leaving voluntarily. Isn't it possible that they were genuinely in need of help and simply overstayed their welcome? I looked directly at Harold and Dolores sitting at the defense table and thought about Frank Chen dying while they robbed him, about Margaret Williams losing her life savings to people she'd trusted. No, I said firmly, people who are genuinely in need of help don't lie about why they need it. They don't research their victims and keep detailed files about their vulnerabilities. They don't systematically drain bank accounts and forge documents. They don't move from victim to victim, refining their deception techniques. But surely you understand that elderly people facing homelessness might make desperate choices. I understand that my age and the age of the other victims made us targets, not objects of sympathy. Harold and Dolores specifically chose elderly victims because they believed we would be easy to manipulate and unlikely to fight back. The defense attorney seemed to realize he was making his clients look worse with each question, so he ended his cross-examination quickly. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified twice more, once during the prosecution's rebuttal, and once when the defense tried to suggest that I was exaggerating the impact of Harold and Dolores' crimes. Rebecca Torres asked me to describe what my life had been like during the 6 weeks they'd lived in my house, how it had felt to lose control of my own space, my own routine, my own sense of security. I became a stranger in my own home, I testified. I couldn't use my kitchen table because it was covered with Harold's business papers and Dolores's craft projects. I couldn't watch television in my own living room because Harold needed quiet for his phone calls. I couldn't have friends over because there was no space for anyone except Harold and Dolores and their belongings. How did this affect you emotionally? I felt invisible. Like my needs, my comfort, my right to live peacefully in my own home didn't matter. Like I existed only to serve other people's convenience. And when you learned that they had lied about why they needed to stay with you, I felt violated. Not just financially, but personally. They had studied me, calculated how to manipulate me, and used my kindness against me. They made me doubt my own judgment and question whether I could trust my instincts about people. Do you believe their actions constituted elder abuse? Absolutely. They targeted me specifically because of my age. Assuming I would be too polite or too confused to resist their manipulation, they exploited the fact that elderly people often feel obligated to help family members, even when those family members are lying to them. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was swift and comprehensive, guilty on all charges for both Harold and Dolores. Judge Patricia Hendricks, the same judge who had sentenced them in my case, looked older and more weary than she had 2 years earlier. She had presided over the testimony about Frank Chen's death, Margaret Williams's financial ruin, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly people. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," she said, "you have been convicted of operating a criminal enterprise that specifically targeted elderly victims for financial exploitation. You researched your victims, planned your approaches, and executed sophisticated fraud schemes designed to exploit their trust and generosity." Harold stood slowly, his hands shaking, while Dolores remained seated, staring at the floor. "The court finds that your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of elder abuse. You didn't just steal money or property. You stole your victims' sense of security, their ability to trust their own judgment, their faith in human decency." Judge Hendricks paused, looking directly at Harold and Dolores. "Frank Chen died, believing he was helping friends. Margaret Williams will spend the rest of her life afraid to trust anyone who offers assistance. Your other victims have been similarly traumatized by your deliberate exploitation of their vulnerabilities. Harold Walsh, you are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Dolores Walsh, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are jointly ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $247,000. The gavel fell with the finality of justice delivered. As court officers led Harold and Dolores away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the damage they'd caused. Couldn't restore Frank Chen's life or Margaret Williams's savings. Rebecca Torres found me in the courthouse hallway afterward. "Thank you, Mrs. Rogers. Your testimony was crucial to this conviction. Will this prevent them from hurting other people?" "For the next several years, yes. And their conviction will serve as a warning to other potential predators that elder abuse crimes are taken seriously by the legal system." Janet Kim appeared beside us, her eyes red from tears. "Mrs. Rogers, I can't thank you enough. I know this won't bring Dad back, but at least he'll have justice. Your father sounded like a wonderful man. I'm sorry this happened to him." "He was, and you know what? I think he would have been proud of you for fighting back, for protecting other people who couldn't protect themselves." As I left the courthouse that afternoon, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had started with a turkey cooling on my kitchen counter while strangers moved furniture into my house without permission. It had continued through months of legal proceedings, difficult conversations with family members, and the slow process of rebuilding my sense of self and security. Now it was ending with the knowledge that my decision to seek justice had helped protect other vulnerable people, had sent a message that elder abuse would not be tolerated, had contributed to a legal precedent that might prevent future victimization. The restitution payments would continue, larger now to include compensation for Harold and Dolores's additional victims. The money would go into the legal aid fund I'd established, helping other elderly people access the legal representation they needed to fight financial exploitation. But more important than the money was the knowledge that I had found my voice, had learned to stand up for myself and others, had discovered that being kind didn't require being weak. As I drove home to my quiet house, my garden, my space arranged exactly as I wanted it, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. Complete peace with who I had become. The woman who had once been afraid to ask guests to leave her own house was gone. In her place was someone who understood that true strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Harold and Dolores had intended to make me their victim. Instead, they had accidentally created their most formidable opponent. And that transformation, painful as it had been, was worth everything that had come before. 5 years have passed since that September courthouse victory, and my life has settled into rhythms I could never have imagined during those dark 6 weeks when my home was invaded by people who mistook my kindness for weakness. The morning sun streams through my kitchen window as I prepare coffee, and I smile at the simple pleasure of using my own table, in my own space, without asking anyone's permission. The legal aid fund that grew from Harold and Dolores's restitution payments has helped over 40 elderly victims of financial abuse. Every month, I receive letters from people who found the courage to fight back against family members, caregivers, or supposed friends who were exploiting them. Their stories remind me that what happened to me was not unique, but my response to it was powerful enough to create ripples that continue spreading outward. Marcus visits every Sunday now, a ritual we established after years of rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions. He brings groceries he knows I prefer, helps with minor household projects, and most importantly, asks about my life with genuine interest rather than obligation. The man who once volunteered my house to solve other people's problems has learned to respect boundaries, to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, and to take responsibility for his own choices. Last month, he brought someone special to meet me. Jennifer is a widow about his age, a teacher like I once was, who lost her husband to cancer 2 years ago. She has 3 grown children who live across the country, and she's learned to build a meaningful life on her own terms. When Marcus introduced us, I could see in her eyes the same quiet strength that I'd had to rediscover in myself. "I've heard so much about you," Jennifer said as we sat on my front porch, sharing iced tea and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across my garden. "Marcus tells me you're the strongest person he knows." I laughed at that, thinking of the woman I'd been 5 years ago, so afraid of conflict that I'd allowed strangers to take over my home rather than risk family displeasure. "I'm not sure about strong, but I've learned to trust my own judgment." "That's the same thing, isn't it?" "Maybe it is." Strength doesn't always look like dramatic confrontations or righteous anger. Sometimes it looks like an elderly woman quietly packing a potato salad back into her car when she realizes she's not welcome. Sometimes it looks like hanging up the phone when someone tries to guilt you into accepting unacceptable behavior. Sometimes it looks like sitting in a courtroom and calmly explaining to a jury how predators target vulnerable people. The house itself has become a different kind of sanctuary than it was when Frank was alive. Then, it was our shared refuge from the world. Now it's my chosen space, arranged entirely to suit my needs and preferences. The dining room table holds puzzles and books instead of other people's business papers. The living room is set up for quiet conversations with friends who visit because they enjoy my company, not because they need something from me. I've made new traditions that would have been impossible during those months when my home was invaded. Wednesday evenings, my book club meets here, 6 women who've become dear friends through our shared love of stories and our appreciation for honest conversation. We discuss everything from mystery novels to memoirs, and inevitably our talks turn to our own experiences of growing older, finding strength, and refusing to become invisible in a world that often dismisses elderly women. Ethel is still my closest neighbor and confidant, though she's slowed down considerably at 86. When her children suggested she might need to move to assisted living, she asked me to help her evaluate her options. Together, we toured facilities, researched home care services, and ultimately found a solution that allows her to remain in her own house with the support she needs. The difference was that she made these choices herself, with honest information and people who cared about her well-being rather than their own convenience. The garden Frank and I planted together has evolved into something that reflects my current interests and physical capabilities. I've added raised beds that are easier on my back, planted flowers that attract butterflies and hummingbirds, and created a small meditation area where I can sit quietly and reflect on how far I've traveled from the woman who once thought family obligation meant accepting any treatment others chose to dish out. Margaret Williams visits occasionally, driving down from Pine Ridge with her daughter, who moved back home after Harold and Dolores stole her mother's savings. Margaret never fully recovered financially from their theft, but she's regained her confidence and her ability to trust her own instincts. She's become an advocate for other elder abuse victims, speaking at community centers and senior facilities about recognizing the warning signs of financial exploitation. "You showed us it was possible to fight back," she told me during her last visit. "Before your case, I thought what happened to me was just bad luck, something I had to accept. You proved that criminals should face consequences, even when they're family members or people we trusted." The ripple effects continue in ways I never anticipated. The legal precedent established by Harold and Dolores's convictions has been cited in dozens of other elder abuse cases across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Prosecutors now have a clearer framework for pursuing charges against people who exploit elderly victims through housing fraud and financial manipulation. Detective Mitchell, who first called me about Harold and Dolores's additional crimes, recently retired from the police department. At her retirement party, she made a point of telling me that my willingness to testify had been crucial to her unit's success in prosecuting elder abuse cases. "You gave us the template," she said. "You showed us how these crimes work, how to document them, and how to present them to juries in ways that make the systematic nature of the abuse clear. Dozens of other victims have gotten justice because you were brave enough to stand up for yourself first." Harold died in federal prison 3 years ago, his health finally giving out under the stress of incarceration and the weight of his choices. Dolores was released early due to medical issues and lives now in a supervised care facility. Her cognitive decline making it unlikely she'll ever again be capable of the sophisticated manipulation she once practiced. I felt no satisfaction in learning of their fates, but I felt no guilt either. They had faced the natural consequences of their decisions, just as everyone else must. The monthly restitution payments stopped with Harold's death, but the legal aid fund had grown large enough by then to be self-sustaining. Last year, we helped a 90-year-old veteran whose grandson had been forging checks from his account. The year before, we provided legal representation for a widow whose daughter-in-law had moved into her house and refused to leave. In each case, the victims found the courage to seek help because they'd heard about other elderly people who had fought back successfully. Marcus and Jennifer married last fall in a small ceremony in my backyard, the same space where Cassandra had once directed moving crews and Harold had conducted loud business calls. The contrast wasn't lost on me. This celebration was about two people who had learned from their mistakes, who approached their relationship with honesty and mutual respect, who understood that love requires boundaries as much as it requires generosity. During the ceremony, Marcus spoke about the lessons he'd learned from watching his mother find her strength. "She taught me that enabling people isn't love," he said, his voice carrying across the garden where Frank and I had once planned our future together. "She taught me that real family supports each other without exploitation, that kindness requires wisdom, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue people from their own choices." As I listened to my son acknowledge the growth we'd both experienced, I thought about the woman I'd been when this journey started. She wasn't weak or foolish, but she was naive about the ways people could exploit kindness. She believed that family obligation meant accepting any treatment others chose to dish out, that being helpful meant saying yes to every request regardless of the cost to herself. That woman learned, through painful experience, that boundaries aren't barriers to love, but requirements for healthy relationships. She learned that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish or unkind, it makes you someone who can help others from a position of strength, rather than victimhood. Now, as I approach my 78th birthday, I understand that the invasion of my home by Harold and Dolores was both the worst thing that happened to me in the years after Frank's death, and the catalyst for discovering who I really was underneath all that reflexive accommodation. I am a woman who spent 43 years shaping young minds, who helped build a home and a marriage that lasted 45 years, who raised a son and saw him through college and into adulthood. I am someone who faced widowhood with grace, who built a meaningful retirement, who found the strength to defend herself and others when circumstances demanded it. I am not defined by the 6 weeks when strangers invaded my home, but I am shaped by my response to that invasion. I found my voice, learned to trust my instincts, and discovered that true kindness sometimes requires saying no to people you love. The potato salad I packed up and took home from that long-ago barbecue has become a symbol in my mind of the moment when I stopped accepting treatment that diminished my worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply leave, taking your contributions with you, refusing to participate in your own diminishment. My story isn't unique. Elderly people across the country face financial exploitation, housing fraud, and emotional manipulation from family members and strangers alike. What makes my experience different is that I fought back, sought justice, and created legal precedents that help other victims find their own strength. The house where Harold once conducted business calls at 6 in the morning now hosts quiet coffee conversations with friends who respect my space and my time. The dining room where Dolores spread her craft projects now holds family dinners where everyone contributes and no one assumes they can take over. The living room where strangers once installed their entertainment system now welcomes book clubs and bridge games, and the kind of gentle socializing that feeds the soul without depleting it. This is what victory looks like when you're 78 years old and have learned to value your own peace above other people's convenience. It's not dramatic or flashy, but it's real and it's mine. Built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and the understanding that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.